Good afternoon, everybody. I am Asaf Romarowski. I am the Executive Director of the Association for Middle East and Africa, and it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you once again to our webinar series. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend and colleague, Franck Salameh. Franck is a professor of Near East Studies at Boston College. He is also the editor-in-chief of our journal. And he's been a long-time life member, really, of ASMEA, and is also a member of the ASMEA Academic Council. Franck is a prolific historian and scholar and a linguist, I know specifically when it comes to the area of the Levant and Lebanon, and he's done a great deal of significant work on many of these issues, and is really somebody worth reading and worth learning from on a lot of these issues. This afternoon, Franck will talk to us about the latest that's happening as a result of the war and as about what's happening, how it's impacting his area of research, and then we will take it from there. The format will be as such. Those of you who've been with us in the past know Franck will talk for about 25 minutes or so. Then we'll go into Q&A. If you have questions, and we encourage as many questions as possible, please type them in via the chat, and we will answer them in a timely fashion. If we do not get to your questions this afternoon, I apologize in advance. We will do our best to respond after the webinar, and we'll take it from there. But really, without further ado, Franck, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Asaf. I can be heard okay, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Asaf. Thank you, ASMEA. Thank you for this introduction. I'm not worthy. Just a small corrective. I am not a linguist. I intrude on linguistics. Linguists would not like it if I were described as a linguist. But in any case, I work with languages in an attempt to understand my area of interest. I was trying to come up with a more provocative title for my talk today, but I think I may be going through a dry spell. It's a work in progress, both the title and the content. So that's all I was able to muster for today. I think there will be room for improvement and growth, hopefully after today with your questions. So, excuse me. The title essentially first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people means basically that first we sort things out with the Jews, then we'll come for the Christians. That's essentially what the slogan says. I'm not sure yet about its origin, whether it has some authenticity, some foundation in Muslim thought or Muslim attitudes towards Christians and Jews in their midst, or whether this is simply the product of some angry, resentful, paranoid, non-Muslim mindsets, isolationists, as especially Near Eastern Christians from my part of the world are called. Basically, paranoid Christians unjustly slandering Muslims and Islam and attributing to them attitudes and intents alien to them and their history. All my academic life, which hasn't been that long, but all my academic life I've heard, read, and taught that there's no anti-Semitism in Islam, that anti-Semitism is a Christian malady, that Islam is more tolerant to Christians than Christians themselves are tolerant towards each other and towards others. But all my other life, I've also heard and read this first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people adage, and I've heard it repeated in different contexts and in multiple variants. I've heard it in the 1970s, growing up in war-torn Lebanon. I've heard it in the diaspora. I've heard it in France. I've heard it in America, in places where Islam and Muslims had not been traditionally numerically dominant. I've heard it from Middle Eastern Christians and Jews and some Druze. I've heard it from folks swearing that it's true, it happens, folks presenting me with stories and histories to illustrate first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. Just as I've heard it from those who dismissed it out of hand as a smear meant to tarnish an otherwise tolerant Islam vis-a-vis minorities. Even Bernard Lewis appears to wrestle with this phrase and the history that it elicits and the future that it may be predicting. In his now famous 1976 commentary magazine essay, The Return of Islam, Lewis appears to trace the expression to Western, or let's say to Christian or to Christendom's inability to view Islam as an all-encompassing religion, a Christendom or Christian world that referred to Muslims by way of ethnic terminologies, as in Saracens and Moors and Turks, more recently Arabs. So using these ethnic terminologies rather than referring to Muslims as Muslims tout court. And Lewis notes in this context that, excuse me, if we are to understand anything about what is happening in the Muslim world today, I'll read this quote. If we are to understand anything about what is happening in the Muslim world today and what has happened in the past, we ought to recognize both the universality and centrality of Islam in the lives, worldviews, identities, and loyalties of Muslims. Lewis could have added also, we ought to recognize the supremacy of Islam, but he didn't. So I'll add it here as my modest contribution to our attempts at understanding what's happening in the Muslim world today. But the point remains that it is religion, not language, not ethnicity, not nation or nationality, not citizenship or country that defines Muslims, distinguishes them from the rest of humanity, and indeed favors them over all others. Quran's Surat Al-Imran 110 is very clear in that regard. Kuntum khayru ummatin ukhrijat linnas, it says, you are the finest nation that was brought forth to mankind. You are the finest ummah brought forth to mankind. Even when in the modern era, Muslim reformers had begun borrowing from the West, namely borrowing national ideas, modernism, political language, and notions of citizenship and state, the natural impulses still gravitated towards this very important Muslim identity, not national tendencies. The often trotted out idea of Arab nationalism in its Nasserist and Ba'athist varieties as proof of secularism or secular modernism in the Arab world is the exception that proves the rule, because I argue that there's nothing secular about Ba'athism or Nasserism. They're just Muslim identity light, if you will. This is no more salient than in the history and attitudes of Muslims towards non-Muslims in general, and non-Muslims in the world of Islam more specifically, which is to say non-Muslim subjects of the Muslim state or a Muslim state. And so if we are to look at the history of Jews and Christians under Islam, the record is not a particularly happy one. I'm sure many are going to disagree with me, and that's fair, because Christians and Jews have survived under Islam. That is and uncontrovertible truth, but they've not fared particularly well. And what remain of them today are mere museum curiosities in the case of Christians. And in the case of Jews, what remains is a recalcitrant, belligerent entity, a remnant of the, as is often described, the remnant of the hated Crusader states of the Levant, awaiting the solution. And this is an image and a prediction, the image of Israel as a remnant of the Crusader state, and the prediction of it withering away eventually, is often used in Arabist and Islamist, and of late in Palestinianist discourse. Incidentally, and I want to open a brief parenthesis here relative to this idea of the Muslim Arab obsession with Crusader states and Palestinianism eventually doing away with this last remnant of the Crusader states, Israel. It's important to note that, and this ties into this idea of first the Saturday, then the Sunday. It's important to note that when European Christians, Franks, Crusaders, when they came east, they were coming into a world still dominated by Eastern Christians, demographically, culturally, linguistically. They were coming into not Muslim lands, much less a Muslim heartland, but in fact, they were coming into borderlands and disputed holy lands, still inhabited by a large proportion of indigenous Christians and Jews, in a space where Muslims themselves and users of the Arabic language were still a minority. As is the case in most colonial exercises, the colonist remains a minority for a very long time, and we're talking 5 centuries here. So in this context of history, considering long-term historical events and structures, what the French call the temps long, the longue durée history, Christians and Jews have not fared well under Islam. And this is not a judgment. It's not an indictment. It's a simple observation. And so the pressing question of the 20th century, and as we're learning in these first few decades of the 21st century, the pressing question becomes whether Islam is willing and able to tolerate sovereign non-Muslim entities in its midst, a Christian enclave in what used to be Lebanon and a Jewish enclave in Israel. That's where the phrase first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people becomes interesting, I think. And although there seems to have been a reversal of sorts in the chronology predicted by the slogan, the Sunday people appear to have been done away with before the Saturday people, that doesn't really matter much. What matters is that what is going on today between Israel and Hamas, and what appears to be Israel and Hezbollah, is a clear indication of this phrase's stay in power. From its inception, writes Bernard Lewis, now quote, Islam has been a religion of power. And in the Muslim worldview, it is right and proper that power should be wielded by Muslims and Muslims alone. Others may receive the tolerance and benevolence of the Muslim state, provided that they clearly recognize Muslim supremacy. That Muslims should rule over non-Muslims is right and normal. That non-Muslims should rule over Muslims is an offense against the laws of God and nature. And this is true whether in Kashmir, Palestine, Lebanon, or Cyprus. End of quote. That is why Israel, with this as a background, that's why Israel is an anomaly from an Islamist and Arabist perspective. And before Israel, Lebanon was the anomaly until it was corrected by stripping it of its meaningful sovereign Christian content. So first came the Sunday people in this case, and now on to the Saturday people. I forget who it was who spoke of essentially 5 models that Middle Eastern Christians and Middle Eastern, let's say Middle Eastern minorities used 5 models in order to resolve their minoritarian status. I've used those examples in many different contexts. I think it was Asher Sasser who first came up with this idea of 4 or 5 models for minorities to deal with their minoritarian status. But I've since given them different names. I'll go through them very quickly, and you'll understand why I'm mentioning those 5 models that essentially all non-Muslim minorities have used in order to deal with their minoritarian problem. The first model is the Dhimmi model, and this is the model of Egypt's Copts, recognizing and accepting their inferior status, not demanding political relevance or political participation, accepting political breadcrumbs, and recognizing and not overstepping their bounds as a minority people. And they're left pretty much alone until they're not. That's the first model, the Dhimmi model. The second model is what I call the Janissary model. And this is the model of the Greek Orthodox Christian community and the Greek Orthodox's invention of secular Arab nationalism, essentially creating a polity for themselves outside of Islam, where they would be treated as equals to Muslims, as fellow Arabs, rather than Christian dhimmis. That model failed because, as I mentioned briefly before, Arab nationalism is anything but secular. The third model is what I termed the Taqiyya model, and this is the model of the Alawites of Syria, but also the Druze of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. And Taqiyya comes from the Arabic dissimulation. So basically, a minority dissimulating, hiding their true feelings, their true identities, and advocating for the identity of the dominant ethnos. So in Lebanon, the Druze for the longest time had been Lebanese nationalists. In Syria, they are Arab nationalists. And in Israel, they serve in the IDF. So that's the third model. The fourth model is what I like to term the one-state solution. And that's the Lebanese model. Lebanon's Maronite Christians opted for creating a multi-ethnic state, a confederation of minorities, as one Lebanese historian, Jawad Boulos, calls Lebanon as a confederation of minorities, rather than creating a state for Maronites or a Christian state. And that's in my view, the one-state solution. That's what a one-state solution looks like. It looks like Lebanon today, essentially a basket case. And finally, the fifth model, which I call the Swiss model, and the Lebanese would like to be called the Swiss model, but they're not. The Swiss model is essentially the Israeli model, Swiss in the sense of building a fortress and sort of imposing Jewish sovereignty. As I said before, or maybe not, all 5 models have been, or at least for our purposes until now, 4 out of the 5 models have been ingenious, but they've been ingenious failures. Israel is, the Swiss model is still under assault. It's under vicious assault, and the jury is still out on whether or not that Swiss model will survive or fail. Excuse me. So Israel is under assault, and you'll forgive the brief facetious tone here. Israel is under assault not because it is the Switzerland of the Middle East, not because it is the Middle East's only democracy, not because it is an apartheid state. I'm using terms that are, very much in vogue today. Not because it's an apartheid state, not because it's committing a genocide of the Palestinian people, not because it is a settler colonial state, and not because it's a Zionist entity. Simply put, Israel is being assaulted, and that's been the case since its birth, because it's Jewish sovereignty. It is the last remaining crusader bastion in a place where Islam, as Lewis said, where Islam must rule. And because it is now the turn of the Saturday people. That's why I believe that October 7, which most Arabic language media incidentally now refer to with the innocuous phrase, the events of October 7. So I believe that October 7 has at least one origin story grounded in Arab, Muslim, Jew hatred. It may not be anti-Semitism in the Christian or European sense, although it has in fact become that in many cases on steroids. The Arabs and more generally the Muslims' response to Israel has from the get-go been grounded in a form of Jew hatred. It is not a trivial matter that the Arabs of British Mandate Palestine fought the Zionist project throughout the early half of the 20th century as bona fide Muslims under Muslim banners, sometimes under Arab banners, but the two are really interchangeable. Two of the Palestinian Arabs' main national leaders were the Mufti Hajj Amin al-Husseini of Jerusalem and a Damascene petty clerk named Azz-Din al-Qassam, a fiery anti-Jewish, very openly anti-Jewish, anti-Christian preacher who would come to bequeath unknowingly, give his name to two of this conflict's most recognizable actors, Hamas's military wing, the Azz-Din al-Qassam brigades, and the organization's infamous Qassam rockets. Incidentally, this Muslim religious anti-Jewish response to a Zionist project was not limited, and today is not limited to, say, the uncouth, the overly religious, the pious, the half-literate Muslim peasant assaulted, affronted all of a sudden by the arrogance of a recalcitrant dhimmi overstepping his bounds. This anti-Jewish sentiment is prevalent in enlightened society, in modernizing, modern, secular, progressive, in Arab nationalist literature, where Jews, Yahud, is the term of choice, referring to Israel, to Israelis, to Zionists, and of course to Jews, without nuancing. You see this in Arabic language public debates, on television, on social media, in political discourse, in journalistic treatments of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And for my purpose, what I want to share with you very briefly today, in traditional modern Arabic literature, in major, widely read publications by rock stars, really prominent literary figures like Mahmoud Darwish, like Ghassan Kanafani, and like Nizar Qabbani. And I'll provide a couple of examples briefly. Nizar Qabbani is known as the Arabic literature's feminist. He wrote feminist poetry. He raged against traditional societies, Muslim traditions, etc. In 1967, he publishes a long-form poem titled Marginalia on the Notebook of Defeat. Those of you who know Arabic, هوامش على دفتر الهزيمة. A long-form poem that transforms him from a feminist poet, a romantic poet, to a nationalist poet. Arab nationalist, but with some variations, even getting in touch with the Islamic symbolism of Arab nationalism. So in this poem, he excoriates the Arabs for collecting yet another defeat at the hands of the inferior Jew, and he writes in Arabic, among many passages in the poem that I would like to familiarize you with, but I picked this one for today. It says in Arabic, ما دخل اليهود من حدودنا إنما تسربوا كالنمل من عيوبنا. In plain English, the Jews, not the Zionists, not Israelis here, but the Yahud, ما دخل اليهود. The Jews did not merely breach our borders, indeed they crawled in like ants through the cracks of our flaws. End of quote. What ought to give us pause in this snippet, I think, what gives me pause is not merely the use of Jews instead of Israelis, but in fact also the classic anti-Semitic trope of the insidious, duplicitous Jew, taken straight out of one of the most widely read books of history in the Arab world, the Protocols. The Jew stealthily crawling through the cracks of the Arabs' weaknesses and into the lands that ought to forever remain the Muslim bailiwick. This same otherwise secular Arab nationalist, Nizar Qabbani, dreamt all his life and imbued his poetry post 67 with one day redeeming Muslims and restituting them to Muslim Spain. And Spain and Palestine are always used interchangeably in the same poem. He alludes to both, sometimes in the same strophe. In a 1966 poem titled Granada, Qabbani sneers at his Spanish tour guide when she describes herself to him as a Spaniard. He writes, "How sweet to meet by chance, without prior plans, two brown eyes glaring, glittering from my past, centuries of my history dripping from those eyes. Are you a Spaniard?" I asked. "Why, of course I am," she proudly blared. "Granadan, born and bred." "Granadan," I snickered under my breath. Suddenly, 7 centuries of my history began arising from deep slumbers. 7 centuries of me coming to life in them, 2 brown eyes. Umayyads with flags unfurled, horses neighing, galloping my way. How ironic. History returning me to this dark-skinned, brown-eyed descendant of my people. Soon I was gazing at our old house in her eyes, my mother's eyes, Damascus, its rivers flowing, fluttering like my beautiful Granadan's hair, her face Arab, her lips Arab, squeezing in them 7 centuries worth of my homeland's golden sunshine, my heart bleeding as she bragged about the glory of her Granadan forefathers. Her forefathers? How ironic. Hands in pockets, I search in vain for my old house keys in Granada. Old house keys. Months before he died in 1998, Qabbani would again excoriate the Arabs on account of Oslo and the prospects of peace with the Jews, not the Israelis, in yet another one of his trademark beautiful beautiful poetry, saturated not only with negationist, um, negationist attitudes, but also with borderline anti-Semitic tropes and yearnings for a Muslim golden age, and also expropriating pre-Muslim history and claiming it to Palestinians and Arabs in general, making as if Islam spread in a vacuum. A brief snippet of this poem, and I'll begin wrapping up. Sorry if I went over the allotted time. So he writes, for the 15th time, Granada is being taken from us. For the 50th time, history has fallen from our hands. Our heroics have fallen from our hands. Seville has fallen from our hands. Antioch has fallen from our hands. Not a single Andalusia remains within our grasp. They stripped us of our doorways and our walls. They stripped us of our wives and our children. They stripped us of our olive trees and olive oil and the brickstones of our roads. They ripped baby Jesus, son of Mary, from his mother's bosom, and they drove their so-called reconciliation into us like a dagger in an act of rape. End of quote. I love his, maybe I cannot transmit my love of his mood swings to you, but I love these irredentist antics. Ghassan Kanafani does something similar, but in a more elegant way. Ghassan Kanafani, for those who don't know him, he is the father of the short story, modern short story in Arabic literature. He wrote short stories and novellas. He was the intellectual of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the most widely read, or one of the most widely read novelists in Arabic. In any case, he is the novelist of the Palestinian cause. His most famous novella is called Men in the Sun, and throughout the narrative, the Jew is omnipresent, not the Zionist, not the Israeli, but the Jew. Years ago, I showed a film, an Arabic film adaptation of Men in the Sun in one of my classes. A beautiful Egyptian adaptation in black and white, as we say here in Massachusetts. It's a film that was ati-fati. It was a good film. I had students read the English translation of Men in the Sun beforehand in order to have a conversation later on. As I said, the film was great. What gave me pause, it was the first time that I watched it, was the subtitles. Every time the Arabic scenario mentions Jews and Jewish, the English subtitles West-splain them into Zionist. Sort of fudging the foundational element of modern Arabic bel-lettres, Men in the Sun, as Kanafani himself wrote it. It was a fantastic teaching moment, because this is what the conversation later on centered around: how you translate Arabic feelings in Arabic literature into English, and how do you come from the Jews, into Zionists in English. I'll conclude here by saying that what happened on October 7, 2023 was, in the context of first the Saturday people and the Sunday people, was, I believe, just the latest chapter in a centuries-long saga that can no longer be contemplated while giving short shrift to this slogan: first the Saturday, then the Sunday. Beyond the usual platitudes, slogans about land and refugees and rights of return and justice and Jerusalem, there are deeper cultural intellectual, and religious questions that need to be considered seriously, without emotions, just seriously considering them. The couple of authors that I mentioned, there's also Mahmoud Darwish, whom I didn't mention. I didn't have actual print text of his as I was preparing this, but I hope that Kabani and Kanafani will help shed some light on whether or not even secular Muslim intellectuals will ever be willing or able to tolerate non-Muslim sovereignty in what is deemed the world of Islam. And I'll conclude with yet another quote, words spoken from Beirut some 4 decades ago by one of the Sunday people, words summarizing what amounts really to very modest demands that the Sunday people were making in late 1970s Lebanon, words that could very well have been written last night with the same resonance and topicality by one of the Saturday people. Our demands are fairly modest, noted that Sunday person almost 50 years ago. Quote, on this very spot of our planet, as a society that has been living under threat of dissolution for the past 14 centuries, it is high time for us to spell out our demands without fear and without compunctions. Freedom and security are all that we're asking for. Freedom for our society to prosper, freedom for our society to live, teach, preserve, perpetuate, and transmit our millennial traditions, our beliefs, our cultural accretions, and our values without fear of uncertainty and without threats of dissolution hanging over our heads. Our second demand is security for our society. Security in all that term entails. Security in the sense that we no longer be subjected every 10 years or so to the onslaught of neighbors unhappy with our presence, unhappy with our freedom, unhappy with our prerogatives as a sovereign, distinct society. Security in the sense that the adage, all that it takes is 5 Palestinians to throw you into the sea. This was a slogan very common in the Lebanese Civil War, which was initially a war pitting Lebanese Christians against Palestinians, and a slogan oft repeated by Yasser Arafat, Abu Iyad, and others, that all it takes is 5 Palestinians to throw you into the sea. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So security, we're asking for security in the sense that the adage, all it takes is 5 Palestinians to throw you into the sea, will no longer be our neighbor's slogan of choice and will no longer be brandished to be hung over our heads. End of quote. Today, there are no more Sunday people in Lebanon able to speak in such terms and with such clarity. So perhaps it is now the Saturday people's turn to turn things around, or like the Lebanese did, turn themselves in. Thank you.
Wonderful, Frank. Thank you for that. That was great, and I appreciate you taking us through all of that. So the floor is now open for questions. If you have questions, please type them in via the chat. I think we have one. Suzanne, why don't you start with that, and then I know Alex has a question, and we'll go there.
Okay, sounds good. So we have a question here for you, Frank, submitted by Eden Fry, and she writes, in talking about Lebanon and Israel to illustrate the Saturday Sunday theme, but that perhaps as endangered as these two entities are, is Armenia, which has sheltered other Christians as well as Assyrians. True, the Muslim threat here is not from an Arab Muslim, but from an entitled Azerbaijani Muslim state. Do you regard the Armenian case less threatened by Muslim power grabbing? And if so, why?
It's not really my area, even though I should get deeper into the Armenian question. Part of my family is Armenian, and I'm ashamed that this is not something that I look at in Armenia proper. But my guess is that listen, I used Arab and Muslim interchangeably in my area of interest because I find that proper to do. Most adherents to Arab nationalism are Muslim Arabs, so I don't feel like I'm oversimplifying by using them interchangeably. But the common denominator here is Islam. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about Islamism, I'm not talking about Muslim fundamentalism, I'm talking about Islam as a way of life. And I make a distinction between Islam and Muslims. They're not the same thing. Okay, I'm not saying that Muslims are like this or all Muslims are like that, but there is a sense, as Lewis described, of this sense of that Islam should reign supreme. So in the case of the Armenians, I don't know how ingrained in Muslim tradition are Azerbaijani Muslims, but I sense that the situation is very similar. That there is a certain and I know I'm gonna get a lot of pushback on this, but there is a certain sense of righteousness from a Muslim perspective. So I wouldn't be surprised if this were the impulse of anti-Armenian events in Azerbaijan. But with the caveat that the history is different, the ethnicities are different, the fact that there are many different Christian and Jewish denominations in my area of interest in the Levant, whereas the Armenians are essentially a single nation, if you will, with the same kind of esprit de corps. That's my piece.
Okay. Alex, why don't you take your question?
Sure. So thanks very much for this. I mean, it's very, very thought-provoking, and I have all sorts of observations and comments. One area, which maybe we can get to later, has to do with really intellectual history and reflections back and forth between, if we can still use the words, Occident and Orient. And but really, I want to focus in just on the question of literature. And you mentioned that Yahud is a kind of stand-in for Israel. Does this obsession, or is it obsession in the larger totality of contemporary Arabic language literature? Do the Yahud come up frequently, or are there other themes?
Oh, I'm sure there are.
I'm sure there are,
themes,
but
and I grew up with some of them. A very sort of common, polite phrase that people of my generation encountered was the Zionist entity. So that was used in polite company. But Yahud is used in many more contexts, and many negative contexts, and sometimes used as an insult, as is today. I mean, also Zionist is used as an insult, but more so with Yahud. I mean, you do say things in, you know, in spoken Arabic, like, you know, you're doing this like the Yahud, or don't be like the Yahud, or I mean, it's very common. And you see it in the literature. I mean, it's I only quoted two people. They're not they're not marginal. They are representative of respectable Arabic literature. So yeah, there are other terms, but if they're not used interchangeably, I think Yahud takes precedence.
But does Arabic literature as a whole have Yahud on the brain? Or are we
modern Arabic literature? Yes. The modern Arab nationalist literature? Yes. I mean, the founding text, if you will, of Arab nationalism is a French text by Najib Azuri titled I forget the French original title. The birth of the Arab nation. I think l'essor de la nation arabe en Asie turque. The awakening of the Arab nation in Turkish Asia. Half of the book deals with le péril juif, the Jewish peril. This is Arab nationalism. I mean, you cannot turn a single page in that book without seeing the word juif, Jewish. And this is if you will, this is the founding text of 20th century Arab nationalism. Granted, it is not in Arabic. The Arabic texts would come later, but this is essentially what inspired what would come later in Arabic language, let's say Arabic language literature. But I do consider this book part and parcel of the corpus of Arabic literature written in non-Arabic language.
Very good. We should go on to some other questions.
Yeah. Emily, will you do me a favor? Will you please unmute our friend and colleague, Mayor Litvak? Mayor has a question for you, Frank, and I know Mayor is an old colleague, so I wanted to allow him to be able to articulate his question.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Frank, for this very insightful and sad lecture, but I want to make a small comment. You mentioned at the beginning that there's a claim that there's been no Arab anti-Semitism. I think we should make a distinction between traditional Muslim anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism. I think if you look at traditional Muslim anti-Judaism, it was a perception that came from Muslim superiority over the Jews. They were the dominant majority, the Jews were the minority. It was criticism of Jewish religion, of Jewish scriptures, very much from a position of disdain. Modern Arab anti-Semitism is a response to the Muslim world which feels threatened by modernity, by the West, precisely the sentence that you mentioned before, that Islam should reign supreme, is threatened by modernity. And the Jews are identified with modernity. And then modern anti-Semitism includes three elements which did not exist in traditional anti-Judaism. It is the demonization of the Jews, protocols, blood libel, etc., conspiracy theories, and finally, genocidal elements which exist in modern Arab or Islamist anti-Semitism, which did not exist in traditional Arab anti-Judaism. I think making this distinction would help us, and I think support your argument. I mean, I'm not arguing with you. I think it will support your argument.
I completely agree with you, of course, and thank you very much for that comment. And I completely agree that that it's scripturally anti-Judaism, or let's say contempt. But contempt for Jewishness and the Jews. In a similar way, contempt for the Christians. But as I noted, and I think as you alluded, this has changed, and especially with the events of October 7th, this has come out in the open as openly, and I mean the ideas of the conspiratorial ideas that you mentioned, and genocide and blood libels are very common. I mean, I'm sure you look at the social media and even traditional journalistic treatments, those themes are recurrent. One point I wanted to stress also with regards to anti-Semitism and how prevalent it's become, and this is pre October 7th. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a bona fide history book. It is treated as such. It goes through tens of printings. It is very widely read. You know, the adage, what is it? Baghdad writes, Lebanon prints, and Egypt reads, or something. Essentially, that Lebanon prints. This book in multiple editions and multiple languages, not only in Arabic, but they also publish it in French translation and English translation in Beirut. You cannot go into a bookstore and not find copies of the Protocols. People consume it like hotcakes. So it is, it is changing, and not to not to indict Islam and Muslims, Christians also in Lebanon, since they have been dhimmified, are very, very well versed in elements of this book. So, long short, I agree, and thank you for your comment.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mayor. So we're going to go on to our next question. Suzanne?
Yes. Okay. So we have a question here from Larry Simpson, and he writes, where does the Syrian poet Adonis fit with the intellectuals you discussed in your talk?
Thank you, Larry, for this question. I love Adonis. Adonis has gone through multiple stages in his voyage from Damascus to Beirut to France. Modern Adonis, I think, is staying outside of this fray. First of all, he's a nonagenarian. He's very old, but very much still alive. I don't think he has entered the fray. I have not seen him. He has not written that I'm aware of, a single journal article or op-ed weighing in on this. And by and large, even in his, let's say, Muslim fundamentalist phase, even though it was a very brief phase, there is no indication of anything approaching Jew hatred or anti-Semitism. And in fact, he was very much a syncretist in the themes that he used in his poetry, and that was part of the modernism that he was advancing, in that he used in a very respectful way a fusion of Christian themes, Muslim themes, and Jewish themes. So there's no contempt for Jewishness or Jewish history at all. Not in the least in his work, whether his critical work or his poetry. But thank you for this question.
Okay, terrific. All right, so our next question is from Martin Kramer, and he writes just a point regarding the Saturday Sunday slogan. Professor Lewis, Bernard Lewis, in the Middle East and the West quoted it as having accompanied an attack on Cairo synagogues on Balfour Declaration Day in 1945. The mob quickly moved on to attacks on churches as well. This event has a profound effect on many Christians, among them Charles Isawi, who was moved by the attacks to write a pessimistic memo on the Christian plight. Okay, there's not really a question there, unless I'm missing an earlier one.
No, but thank you, Martin, for this. I'm taking notes. As I said in the beginning, this is a work in progress, and I was hoping, I would get this kind of feedback and directions. Thank you. Charles Isawi is one of my. I have many heroes. One of my heroes. Yeah. So thank you for this. I have. I'm not familiar with the article that you mentioned. Perhaps we can communicate later, and you can give me further direction. Thank you.
Great. Okay. All right. So our next question here is from Zach Batat, and he writes, you alluded to the Second Lebanese Civil War and the Palestinians fighting the Christian Lebanese at the end of your talk. I wanted to ask you about that. So allow me to drift to that topic and ask, were the Palestinians the reason the state deteriorated, or were they the straw that broke the camel's back? In other words, is the failure of Lebanon due to the system rather than the Palestinians?
Zach, thank you. Thank you for this question. Of course, the Palestinians were not the cause of the war in Lebanon, and that's why some people still refer to it as a civil war. It is, it was a civil war. The Palestinians were a major actor, and they are, as you put it, the camel that broke the, or vice versa, the camel that broke the straw's back, the straw that broke the camel's back. If you remember the five models that I provided early on in the paper, Lebanon had, or the Christians in Lebanon had an option, and it was a fight between two wings of the Maronite community, a wing that wanted to maintain the 1860 Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, as a distinctly 90% Christian entity, and those who wanted an enlarged Lebanon. The ones who advocated for Grand Liban won, in spite of the French, because the French did not want Grand Liban and they advocated against it. But the wing that won Greater Lebanon was a wing that was coming out of a devastating famine, where half of the mountain's population had perished, and they did not want to remain sort of isolated in a mountainous region without openings to the Mediterranean and openings to the breadbasket in the east, the Bekaa Valley. So they won, even though the French warned against it, even though the Christians had a very slight majority of the population with the newly created state. And the rest, as they say, is history. So as I mentioned, rather than founding a state for the people who founded it, it was a multi-ethnic confederation of minorities. And as the famous French adage goes, what matters in politics are three things: demography, demography, demography. So that's what happened. The Christians lost any reason for maintaining their supremacy in Lebanon, and the Palestinians came at an opportune time. They provided numbers, and they provided a military force that could go against the Lebanese army. But this is not in any way to diminish the role that the Palestinians played. They played a foundational role in the dismantlement of the Lebanese entity, but they were not the cause.
Right. Thank you for that, Frank, and thank you for Zach for your question as well. I'm just paying attention to the clock, Frank, so I'm just going to take one more question if you don't mind. From Alex, it will be the last question, and then we'll bring it to an end. Again, if people have further questions afterwards, feel free to obviously email us after, and we'll do our best to respond. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack here, and obviously you touched a critical chord here that there's a lot to talk about.
And I'm happy to respond in writing, as one of my favorite French authors said. I love writing because it's like speaking, only without interruptions. So
exactly. Oh, good, Alex.
Okay. On that note, I'll try and be brief and not interrupt you or myself too much. There's a pattern that you alluded to at the very beginning of projecting pathologies onto the Middle East, that the Middle East was a kind of happier place spiritually and intellectually if it weren't for the Nazis, if it weren't for the Christians, if it weren't for all sorts of things. But we see the prevalence of intellectual, let's call it, contributions like the Protocols and Mein Kampf, and we see it in the very nature of the nationalistic idea that's reflected in movements like Baathism and so on. And so for 19th century Orientalists, Ignaz Goldziher, projecting his own Jewish kinds of concerns, making the Christian Europeans look bad. It was talking about golden ages, and this gets incorporated. And looking at Said, the Orientalists made us feel bad about ourselves. These kinds of reflexive cycles back and forth, and it gets internalized into the Middle East. And I don't want to be essentializing or anything like that, but what can we say about contemporary intellectual life in the Middle East now? Is it original? Is it derivative? Has it been handicapped by relationships with the West? Where are we? It doesn't sound encouraging from what you've been describing.
Yeah, I think my failing in this talk, I think, is that I have, and I shouldn't say this, is that I picked Palestinianist authors and Arabist authors. They are dominant, they are very vocal, but they're not the only ones. By the same token, those intellectual figures who are who do not get involved in these questions, who are not rabid anti-Jews or anti-Semites, get marginalized very easily. Going back to Larry's question, you take Adonis. Adonis lives in Paris. He teaches, or used to teach, at Collège de France, which is, across the river from the Sorbonne. It's a sort of the secular answer to the religious, or what used to be religious, the Sorbonne. You take the example of Ali Salim, an Egyptian playwright who died in anonymity, who also is outside of that and worked with issues of normalization and peace. And his famous travelogue, my drive to Israel, or something like that, he basically took his car, drove to Israel in an attempt, and this is years after the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, sort of writing about Israeli society like Egyptian society. They're like us, we're like them, we have the same worries, the same hopes, etc. He was marginalized, died in anonymity, and removed from the Egyptian Writers Guild. So I don't want to suggest by any means that this is the only sort of elan in modern Arabic or Middle Eastern literature, but it is dominant. And every 10 years or so, when we have something like what's going on now, it gets revived. In terms of essentialism, I want to say something. I'm not very hard on essentialists. I think essentialism helps us understand things. At least, you know, at least in you know, my breed of students of history, this is how we make sense of the world around us. We sort of try to simplify in order to understand, but certainly not stay there. So you mentioned Said. Said himself was an essentialist. Didn't he essentialize the Orientalists? In any case, and I think, going back to Martin, I think it was Charles Isawi who called him out on his essentialism.
Great. Well, thank you both for that. Alex, we can continue this again with Frank later on afterward. There's a lot, obviously, to talk. But really, Frank, I want to take the opportunity once again to thank you for talking to us this afternoon. There's obviously a lot to discuss, and you put it in a great way that only you can do it, you know, in the way as far as the work that you're doing, as far as the context of where we are now with the literature and with the writing that we're seeing out there. So I want to thank you again for taking the time. I want to thank everybody again for joining us this afternoon. We will obviously continue these conversations and be on the lookout for future webinars on a lot of these topics and more. So I wish everybody a good afternoon. Those of you who are overseas, a good evening, and on the West Coast, good morning. And we will continue our conversation soon. So have a good day and talk soon.